He came from a Hasidic family, but he was modern. He was Americanized. He
What
turned.
was it? What was the first name again? I'm not familiar with it.
I'll email you. His name is Sal Mitgang.
So anyway,
Okay.
Let's continue.
So Lamites Amacheni, this last daf, it's easy daf in Beitza, and Be'ez Hashem will finish. The Mishnah begins at the bottom of Lamites Amacheni. Misha Haya Peroisa Be'ir Acheres. A man, let's assume that he deposited his fruits in another city. In other words, in more than Tchum Shabbos away, he deposited his fruits by someone in somebody else's city. And the people of that city, or that person, presumably, I'm saying presumably, the person that he deposited the fruits by, made an erev to bring him the peiros, his fruits, back to him where he is. So the Mishnah says, lo yaviu lo, they're not allowed to bring him the fruits because he didn't make an erev. So technically, he can't go from, let's say he lives in city A and they're in city B. He couldn't go to city B. So even though his fruits are in city B and deposited there, the people from city B cannot bring him the fruits to city A. Vim erev hu. But if he didn't made an erev, so now he made an erev, so his fruits, although being on city B, technically he can go and pick them up and bring them back to city A. So peirosav kamayu, his fruits are like him, and therefore they can come back to where he is and at the city A. Next, on top of the page, a man invited guests to his house. So he invited guests to his house, let's say for the Yom Tov meal, Yom Tov lunch, okay? And those guests came from a place that are outside the Tchum. So they made an erev to come to his house for Yom Tov lunch. What about the leftovers? Can they bring it back to their house and use it for the next Yom Tov night meal? So the Mishnah says, Lo yalicha b'yadam manos. They can't bring home gifts, leftover food, back to their house because the food really belongs to the host, and the host did not make an erev, so they cannot bring that back, the food that they ate by him. Elam kain zika lehem manasem erev Yom Tov, unless he transferred. The word zika, let's say, is transferred. Let's say he before they came, he went over to his friend. The host went over to somebody and says, you know what? You be the agent of my guest and pretend that I'm transferring you the food that I'm going to give them to you today from Erev Yom Tov. So really, and the din is that if you transfer something to somebody's benefit, even though he didn't make a shliach, he didn't command you to do so to accept it on his behalf, but it's his benefit to accept it. So therefore, it's considered done. So when the guests show up, it's really their food was already transferred to their possessions from Erev Yom Tov, and therefore they could bring home the food to their house. Okay, clear. Now, Itmar was taught in a teaching. Hamafkid Peres Eitzel Chaver. This seems very similar to our story in the Mishnah. Someone who deposits fruits to his friend's house, right? So whose erev do we determine where these fruits can go? Because, as you know, in a city, I can make an erev to the south, and my friend can make an erev to the north, right? It doesn't. So whose fruits is it that determines where these fruits are permitted to be travel on Shabbos or Yom Tov? Let's say Yom Tov. So Rav says, "Kiragle mi shevkidu loy." It goes on the steps of who it was deposited by, and the person that was where the fruits were deposited, not the owner, that determines where these fruits can go. So right away, you can see that our Mishnah seems to contradict Rav, disagree with Rav, because our Mishnah said that we always determine the direction of the fruit via the owner, what the owner is, right? Because like we said just now in the Mishnah, because he didn't make the erev, because the owner didn't make the erev. So what determines? It's the owner. And Rav said, no, it's the person you deposited the fruits by. And Shmuel says, we determine the tchum based on the footsteps of the depositor, based on the owner, not the when you deposited by. So first the Gemara goes off on a little slight tangent, and then we'll ask from our Mishnah directly. Lema, let us say, Rav and Shmuel Rav and Shmuel are aligned to their reasoning. that they have in Baba Kama, a similar machlokes in Baba Kama. That now we learned in the Mishnah in Baba Kama. Let's say I have an ox, a little ox, a baby ox, and I go to my friend and I say, can I put my ox here just for a little bit? And he says, bring it in. So im hichnis b'shus bal hachotzer, if he gave me permission to put my ox in his courtyard, so now what happens if his ox damages my ox, or my ox damages his fruit? So if his ox damages my ox, chayav, then he's chayav because he's my shomer. I said, can I deposit it? And he said, come. He didn't say, I'm going to watch it. He said, come, you could put your ox here. So just by motioning that I should come in and leave my ox in his courtyard, that automatically obligates him to be the shomer. Rebbe says not so. Lo'olam ein chayav. He's not obligated to be the shomer. He's not the watchman. Achi kabel olabala bayis lishmar, until the owner of the chatzir says explicitly, I'm going to watch your ox. Just saying, motioning you to come in doesn't mean he accepted upon himself to be the shomer. So the Gemara says, "V'amar Rav Huna amar Rav." Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, "Halacha k'divrei chachamim." The halacha is like the chachamim, that even if you make a motion already, that shows that you're the shomer and you're the owner, that you're going to watch the ox just by motioning the ox to come in. You allowed him to come into your courtyard. So we always assume that the one that's going to watch it is the one that allowed you to come into his yard. So same thing over here by Tchumim. As soon as you deposited your fruits by your friend, once he becomes the shomer, then you lose your rights of Tchumen. What determines where you can take the fruit is where you deposited the fruit. To the person that you deposited by. So, because Shmuel says, halacha karebi. Halacha is like Rebbe. That what? That unless he was makabel to be shomer on it, he's explicitly said that he wants to. We always keep the ownership of the fruits in the owner, unless the one that you motioned to you to come into his yard says explicitly, I'm taking over ownership over here and I'm going to watch it. But as long as he didn't say that, it still remains in the domain of the original owner. And therefore Shmuel said that even if you deposited by your friend, even if you deposited your fruit by a friend, we still consider your fruit to determine regarding Tchum Shabbos. So that's what the Gemara tries to make this like alignment between Rav and Shmuel according to the reasoning of who you paskin like in Baba Kama. So the Gemara says, Leima Rav the Amak Rabban. Rav will always hold like the Rabban, Ushmuel the Amak Rebbe, and Shmuel holds like Rebbe. Amalach Rav will tell you it's not true. Anod the Amri Afil Rebbe. I can hold like Rebbe in Baba Kama. That as only if the owner says I'm makabel accepting myself to watch it, that's when he has an obligation to watch it. Up until that, it remains in the domain of the original owner. But Adkan loikama Rebbe Hasam, Rebbe didn't say his opinion only in Baba Kama. Because anonymously, just by motioning that you could bring your ox into his yard, he didn't makabel shmir. He didn't accept that he's going to watch it. Aval hachabin, in our case, when you deposit your fruits by your friend, hakabel alei nitirase, he guaranteed that he's going to really watch it. So therefore, in our case, when you deposit your fruits by your friend, our discussion is that the friend accepted to watch your fruits. So even that, in that case, Rebbe would hold that it automatically reverts to the domain of the depositee, where you deposited the fruit. So that also should be determined by Tchum Shabbos. Shmuel says the opposite. I'll go according to Rabbanim over there, where it is assumed that the domain is by the deposit where you deposited it. Atkan like Rabban Hasam. Rabbanim didn't say over there that it's automatically in the domain of where you deposited it, because by the case of the ox, you want the other person to take ownership of it and to make all decisions, because the inish, the nekim Torah b'shusei de balachotza, I want, and the person wants that somebody else to take responsibility of his ox. Nobody wants to take the responsibility of their own ox. So he's so happy to give up ownership so that somebody else could watch it. The imazikle, because if the ox would damage somebody else, loy mechayev, I'm not obligated. I gave it over to him. He told me I could put my ox here. So that's enough to, I'm going to relinquish my ownership. That's why Rabbanan said we determine ownership by where you deposited it. Aval hacha, over here, maybe even if you deposited that your friend should watch your fruits, but regarding Tchum Shabbos, you want to still make that determination, you the owner, because it's your fruits and you want to bring it back to where you are. Does a person want the fruits to remain in the domain of his friend? Even though you deposit it by your friend and he's agreed to watch it, but you didn't give him all the rights to the fruit. You want to be able to determine Tchum Shabbos, where these fruits can travel on Shabbos, so potentially you could pick up the fruits on Shabbos and Yom Tov and take them home. So therefore, even the Rabbanim would agree that over here, the determination for Tchum Shabbos would be on the original owner. So the Gemara just rejects this type of trying to linkage between Rav and Shmuel to what they paskin by Baba Kama regarding the ox. But now comes the main question. Now we learned in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that if the owner made an Erev, what determines where these fruits can go is Peirasov, in Erev hu, Peirasov Kamayu. That if the owner made an Erev, then the fruits are like the original owner. But according to Rav, no, even we never look at the original owner. We always look at the person where you deposited the fruits by. If you're going to say like Rav, that we always determine the owner, the Tchum Shabbos, according to where you deposited by the person you deposited by. So who cares? Ki Erev hu my hava. Who cares if the original owner made an Erev? At the end of the day, what determines where these fruits can travel is where the fruits are. Who is watching the fruits? That's what Rav said. So Amar Rav Huna said, and this is a very important point in how to determine our Mishnah, how to understand our Mishnah. Amri B'rei Rav, the Yeshiva Rav will tell you that our Mishnah is not talking about where you deposited your fruits by somebody. To watch it. Nobody's watching your fruit, but somebody said you could keep your fruits here, but nobody is watching it. It's like, it's being watched by itself. Somebody gave you a little corner and told you could put your fruits here, but he's not taking responsibility to watch it. So if the guy's not taking responsibility to watch it, so then what determines where these fruits can go? It's only the original owner. So that's how you have to learn this Mishnah. Again, the Mishnah says if your parents are in another city, but not that you deposited it by somebody else. You actually you put it by somebody else's house, but he said you can keep it in this corner of my house, but I'm not taking responsibility to watch it. So what determines where these fruits can go is the original owner. And that's what our Mishnah just says. That's how Rav's going to say. And then we same idea. Toshima, we learned in a Braisa. Misha Zimin, the Mishnah says, Misha Zimin etzloi oichem. A man invited guests to his house. Lo yilichem ben yodem monos. He can't give them gifts. Elam kein ziklehem in the same Erev Yontiv, unless he transferred the ownership to the guests on Erev Yontiv. The host said to somebody else, take ownership of this food that I'm going to give them. And then when the guests come, they can actually bring the food back to their home. Now, be amrit kirag, but at the end of the day, who's watching it? Who's watching the food till the guests show up? Well, it's the host. According to Rav, if the host is watching the food, then it's what should determine Tchum Shabbos is the host. The Amrit kimash karag l'mishev ki yidu etzloi. If you're going to say like Rav, that the shomer is always the one that determines Tchum Shabbos and where you could carry it. Even if he transferred ownership to the guests, so what? The host is still watching these fruits. So according to Rav, it should be determined, the host should be the one that determines where these fruits could go, not where the guests come from. So the Gemara says, Hachinami, that's not true. As soon as he transferred the ownership through somebody else to the guests, it's the owner saying, I'm not watching this food anymore. It's totally in the domain of my guests. I don't even own this food. I'm not taking responsibility on this food. And in that case, then what's going to determine Tchum Shabbos is the guests, because they technically own this fruit and nobody else is watching. Nobody else is watching it. If you want to say Zika Shani, even if you want to say, the Gemara is trying to say another teretz, but similar, that even if you want to say the host has obligation to watch the food, but when he verbally transferred the rights of Tchum Shabbos to the guests, so then it's really the guests can determine the Tchum Shabbos, not the owner, because even if he still maintains responsibility to watch the food, but he actually verbally transferred the Tchum Shabbos rights to the guests. And that's why that's shot in our Mishnah. Now the Gemara says a story. Rav Chana bar Chanilai. Rav Chana bar Chanilai was in another place. He was in, let's say, city A, and he made a Tchum Shabbos, to go to city B on Yontiv to pick up a piece of meat and bring it back to his city. Erev Yontiv, he went to the butcher. Bought a piece of meat, and apparently he was going to stay a little bit in that city B and then take some of the extra meat back to home to city A, where he's spending the rest of Yontiv. So let's read it. Rachana bar Chanilai, Tula Bisra ba'Avdadasha. On Erev Yontiv, he took a piece of meat that he bought in city B, right, location B, and he hung the meat on the door, so to speak, of where he was going to stay. He was going to stay in, let's say, in a guest house somewhere. He hung a piece of meat that he bought in that city, with the idea was that when he's going to stay a little bit in that city, eat lunch, let's say, and then take the meat home and back to city A. So Asi Lekami Rav Huna, he came before Rav Huna. Can I bring it home back to my house? Amalei, so Rav Huna said, if you hung this meat Erev Yantiv, right, Zilshkil, then you can bring it back to yourself, because you took ownership of that piece of meat on Erev Yantiv, and therefore it's your piece of meat. You determine the Chum Shabbos of that piece of meat. The Inhu Talilach, but if the boarding house, the people who own the hotel where you're staying, they're the one that took the meat from you and hung it on the door or hung it in a certain place, so they're taking possession of it. Loy Tishkol, you can't bring it home. Now, let's see. The Gemara analyzes this. The Gemara says, what kind of psak did Rav Huna say? Even if he hung it up, he went to the hotel that he was going to stay, Erev Yontiv, took the piece of meat, hung it up, right? He took rights to it and he hung it in the hotel that he's going to stay there on Yontiv. Is he allowed to bring it home? Who's technically watching that piece of meat when Yontiv starts? The hotel owner. And therefore, Rav Huna Talmudei de Rav. Rav Huna is a student of Rav. And Rav holds, V'amar Rav, and Rav says that what determines Chum Shabbos is the person that's watching the item, the person that's watching the food, the person that's watching the meat, which is the hotel owner. It's according to determine between where the footsteps of where you deposited, whoever's watching the food. So how can Rav say just because you hung it up in Erev Yontiv, it's yours? So Gemara says, Shane Avredadasha, the Kamisha Yichalai Karen Zavis Tamim. The same idea. As soon as he hung it up, he went to the hotel early on Erev Yontiv and hung up that piece of meat on the door. He showed that I don't want the owner of the hotel to watch this piece of meat. I'm taking responsibility. You're giving me a little corner where I can put the meat, and that's it. You're not taking responsibility to watch it. So therefore, I still maintain my ownership on this food concerning to determine Tchum Yontiv, Tchum Shabbos, where it can go. So fine. The Gemara said, one of the things that Rav Huna said, that if the host hung it up, you can't take it. So Amalei Rav Hillel Rav Ashi. Rav Hillel said to Rav Ashi, the Gemara is going to ask three questions, but basically it's the same question. The problem is that if you're saying that Rav Chana bar Chanilai never gave ownership or rights or responsibility to watch this piece of meat to the hotel owner, so who cares if the hotel owner hung it up? At the end of the day, Rav Chana bar Chanilai bought the piece of meat, and it's his meat, and he never gave up rights, responsibility to anybody to watch it. So why is it that if they hung it up, he can't take it back? So that's Rav Hillel asked Rav Ashi, the inu talulei loy shakal. If they took it, why can't you bring it home? Shmuel said, Sholsha patam, even if you go to another city, on Yontiv, right? You made an Erev and you go to 4,000 amas to another city, and you go to a butcher shop there on Yontiv to buy a piece of meat, or if you're going to pay him after Yontiv, you can take it home. Because the butcher shop knows people are going to pick up meat on Yontiv and take it wherever they want. So it's predetermined that you're going to get this piece of meat. And here, not only did he buy the piece of meat, he didn't buy the piece of meat on Yontiv. He did. Rav Chana bought the piece of meat erev Yontiv. So certainly he should be able to bring it home if he wants to, as long as he didn't give a responsibility to somebody else to watch it. That's question one. Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi v'ini tadulei loy shakal. If just because Ravina said to Rav Ashi, just because the host hung up the piece of meat, Rav Chana can't take it home. The halacha is like Rab Doisa, who said that if there's a predetermined shepherd in a city, even if you give your animal, if there's only one shepherd in the city and you give your animal to that one shepherd on Yontiv, what determines Chum Shabbos for your animal is the shepherd, because it's almost like predetermined that you're going to give your animal to this shepherd on Yontiv. We had this 2 days ago. So same idea. Once you predetermined with this piece of meat is going, so therefore it's really you decide where it can go on Yontiv. It's Rav Chana's decision where it can go on Yontiv. Nobody else owns it. The halacha is like Rab Doisa. And another question, even if the hotel manager took it, he's not allowed, Rav Chana cannot bring it home. But now we learned in the Mishnah, if you own an animal, if you own vessels, we always determine Tchum Shabbos, Tchum Yontiv, according to the original owner. Again, Rav Chana maintained ownership, never gave a responsibility to watch it to anybody else. So therefore, what's the difference? Who hung up the piece of meat? So the Gemara says a very interesting thing. He says, really, it's Rav Chana's meat, and he could bring home the meat, right? It's his meat. He could take it back to his city. But if Rav Chana, we have another problem over here. When you give a meat and you don't remember how it looks, you have a problem called bashash nis'alei min ha'ayim. That meat that's not double wrapped, like as you're familiar with, there's a gzerah chachamim that we can assume that the meat was exchanged. If nobody's watching it, the meat was exchanged for non-kosher meat. So that's what he said. Elo shani Rav Chana b'chanilai de gaver rabbahu. He's a great man. Utrid b'shmaitza. He's always learning, and his mind is not on anything else but his learning. V'hachi kamelein. This is what Rav Huna said to him. If you hunger the piece of meat, then you recognize the piece of meat with a siman. You have like a look that you can recognize this meat because you paid attention to the meat. You have a siman in it. So you didn't forget about it, and you'll remember that the next day when you pick up the piece of meat, oh, this was my meat that I set aside on Erev Yontiv. So even if it's not double wrapped or protected, he can bring it home. Zilshkoy, then you can bring it home. But if you relied on somebody else to hang the piece of meat, you didn't even pay attention to how the meat looked, then you removed your mind from making a sign to yourself, is this the piece of meat? V'loy tishkol, you're not allowed to take it, because even if it's hanging in a Jew's house, we can assume there's an assumption, a wild assumption, is that a bird came, exchanged the meat for a different piece of meat, and you're not going to know that. And that meat that you're going to pick up maybe is not the original meat that you deposited there. It might be treif meat. Therefore, that's what was Rav Huna telling him, don't take it home. New Mishnah, and this will finish the parak. If an animal, a sheep, walks into your sheep from a non-domesticated sheep, just happens to walk into your yard, and it's not your sheep, it came from Hefker somewhere, the Mishnah says, Ein mashkin, you can't give it to drink, v'shaychiden, and slaughter the animal, as hamidbarias, undomesticated animals that just walked into your yard, you can't slaughter them because of muktzah, because it was it wasn't designated before Shabbos to be food for you. It's set aside that it's something that you didn't think about. So it's not your food. It's not your animal, and therefore you can't shecht it. Even if it's a hefker piece of, even if it's a hefker sheep or something kosher animal, you're not allowed to shecht it. But if it's a domesticated animal, you're allowed to give it to drink and slaughter the animal. What's called a domesticated animal? Does it have to sleep in your house? What's called a domesticated animal? Halonis beer. It's in the city. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's staying in your house. As long as it's the sheep that's in the city, generally, that's considered domesticated animal. And if you happen to chance upon it and it doesn't belong to anybody, and you want to take ownership and shecht it on Yontiv, you're permitted. But midbarius, but ones that are from the desert or just happen to walk into the city, halonis ba'afar, those that sleep in the meadow, they don't sleep in the city. And this animal that chanced into the city on Yontiv is already mukta out of your mind, and therefore you're not allowed to shecht it.
But how can you tell if it's domesticated or not for sure? I mean, can you really be sure? No.
Well, I guess there were ways to be sure of it. This comes up. It's not something. Let's say you a stray dog. Are you allowed to feed it on Yontiv? Are you allowed to give it food on Shabbos or something like that? So since it's not your animal, it's extra tircha, it's muktzah. You're not supposed to. Only if it's your pet, then you're allowed to.
Mm-hmm.
So same idea. You're not allowed to slaughter it because it was something that you didn't think about. And maybe they had a sign to know if it was a midbar animal, a desert animal, or if it was a domesticated animal. So the Gemara says, why does the Mishnah say that you have to give it to drink? You're allowed to give it to drink and slaughter it. I mean, just say the Isser is not giving an animal a drink, so to speak. You're allowed, just say, am I allowed to slaughter it or not slaughter it on Yontiv? So Milsa Agav Euchei Kamash was telling you a side point, the Mishnah, that before a person slaughters, I think they do this in all their schlachthäuses. The shlashke inish be'emtai, a person should give a lot of water to his animal to drink, and then you slaughter the animal. Because of the adhesion of the skin. In other words, it's much easier to skin an animal after you slaughter it when you gave it a lot to drink prior to the slaughter. So that's what the Mishnah is teaching you, how to slaughter an animal, so it's easier to take it apart. Tanu Rabbanan. Rabbis taught another argument of what is called domesticated and what's non-domesticated. Elohein midbarius, what's called a non-domesticated animal, what is called a domesticated animal. Midbarius are a midbarius animal is a desert animal is Kol sheyotzes bePesach. It leaves the city on Pesach time. V'royes ba'afar, and it's grazing in the meadow. It never comes back to the city. It comes back, let's say in Cheshvan time. It leaves. It's like a yeshiva bacha going to yeshiva. Lahavdil. It goes Pesach time and it comes back b'Revi Rishayna on Cheshvan in the fall. So that's already not. It's not considered domesticated. It's already considered in the midbar. But what's called a domesticated animal? It goes out of the city less than about 2,000 amas away from the city. But when it wants to go to sleep and at night, it comes back to within the 2,000 amas of the city. Rabbi says, saying, both of these are examples of domesticated animal, because even if an animal doesn't come back to the city for months at a time, but if it comes back after 6 months to the city, it's still considered, according to Rebbe, a domesticated animal. So what is called an undomesticated animal? What's called an undomesticated animal? It goes out of the city to the meadow. It never comes back to the city. Wintertime or summertime, it never comes back to the city. So that's called undomesticated. Something that lives out there forever, that's called undomesticated. So it must be that if Rebbe is engaging in this conversation, because Rebbe needs to know what's an undomesticated animal and one's a domesticated animal. But that must be that Rebbe must hold of this concept of muktzah, that if you don't set aside the animal, you're not allowed to, if you didn't know about this animal before Yontiv, you're not allowed to shecht it. Now, this will be only if you hold of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds of the concept of muktzah, that you have to prepare the food before Yontiv. But according to Rabbi Shimon, there's no concept of muktzah. If an animal just shows up undomesticated, according to Rabbi Shimon, you would be allowed to shecht it. So that's the Gemara's question. Umi isle le Rebbe muktzah. Does Rebbe hold of the concept of muktzah, that if you didn't set it aside before Yom Tov to eat, you're not allowed to shecht an undomesticated animal? Rab Shimon, who's the son of Rabbi, asked his father, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Patzile tomorrow Rab Shimon Mahu. If you have unripe dates, according to Rabbi Shimon, unripe dates means that it would never have ripened on the tree. And what they would do is take these unripe dates that couldn't ripen on the tree, and they put it into a basket, and then they become ripe through a special basket. They had a way of making it become ripe even without the tree. So if a person took these dates with the intention of putting it in the basket to ripen later, and then decides to eat it before putting it in the basket, according to Rab Shimon, who doesn't hold a muktzah, is that permitted? Amalei, so Rabbi answered his son, Ein muktzah Rab Shimon. There's no concept of muktzah to Rab Shimon. I mean, as soon as you pick something off the tree, if you can eat it, it's yours. I mean, it's not something muktzah determines whether something is permitted to eat or not permitted to eat on Yom Tov. But what you see from here is that they're discussing the opinion of Rab Shimon. So that's what the Gemara is saying over here. I'll explain what this means. But you see, the question over here is that since Rabbi's son discussed with him what Rab Shimon's opinion is, so the Gemara assumes that Rabbi holds a Rab Shimon. So what's Rabbi coming up with an opinion about domesticated animals and undomesticated animals? Rabbi's opinion himself would be that even an undomesticated animal I could shech, because he holds like Rab Shimon. The only time Rab Shimon will hold that you're not allowed to eat something on Yom Tov is greigus v'tzimukim b'vad. Let's say raisins, grapes, and I'm planned to make raisins out of them. And therefore, it's edible now, but I'm saying I'm going to make raisins or dates, dried figs. So I could have eaten them now, but I said in my mind specifically, I don't want to eat them. Then even Rab Shimon would agree you can't eat them. But if you never had a thought about a food and it shows up like an undomesticated animal, according to Rab Shimon, you should be allowed to eat that. And therefore, if Rabbi, who's like conversing what Rab Shimon's opinion is, it must be that Rabbi holds like Rab Shimon. So why does Rabbi get involved into discussion of what's a domesticated animal, what's an undomesticated animal? So Gemara gives three terutzim. If you want, I can tell you, the fact that these animals are so far out of the city and undomesticated, out in the desert somewhere, it's almost like you pushed it away from your mind in your head, that you said, I'm never ever going to eat these animals on Yom Tov. It's impossible for them to show up. So therefore, that's like the raisins or the dates, where you physically push them away from your mind. And even Rab Shimon would hold that an undomesticated animal, you're not allowed to shech. If you want to say that when he answered his son, he was just answering him what Rab Shimon's opinion is, but Rabbi himself holds like Rabbi Yehuda. The dvar of the Rab Shimon kamale. He was answering what Rab Shimon's opinion is, v'lei lo svirlei. Rabbeinu HaKadosh himself doesn't hold of it. L'hagdil Torah v'aldira, it's try to understand the other side. But he himself, Rabbi, held like Rabbi Yehuda, that there's a concept of muktzah, an undomesticated animal that you never had in mind to eat on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to eat. And the third teretz is, if you want, I can tell you that really Rabbi holds of Rab Shimon. And really, Rebbe shouldn't get involved in this conversation. An undomesticated animal, according to Rebbe, you could shecht it and eat it. If it shows up at your door, shecht it and eat it. But he was explaining, he was trying to understand the Rabbanan, the Devreim, the Rabbanan Kamalahu. He was talking to Rabbanan. He said, according to me, ain't muktzah. This whole thing, domesticated animals, undomesticated animals, doesn't matter. There's no concept of muktzah. But according to you, who want to know the difference between a domesticated animal and an undomesticated animal, because to you it's a big difference because you can't shecht an undomesticated animal. Won't you agree with me? In a case, an animal that's in the city and goes out Pesach time, and it stays out in the meadows far away from the city, and then comes back to the city Cheshvan time when it gets cold out there in the meadows. The Bayos is saying that's called a domesticated animal. That's not called an undomesticated. Just because it stays months away from the city doesn't make it an undomesticated animal. And that's what I have an opinion on that. Like, that's not so. Midbar is saying they're considered still undomesticated. There's so much time removed away from the city. They're called undomesticated animals. You wouldn't be allowed to shecht it according to Rabbanim. But according to Rebbe, this conversation doesn't matter, because he holds even undomesticated animals you're allowed to shecht on Yantiv, because he doesn't hold of this concept of muksa. Hadron Allah Mashilim Paris Islik Allah Masechta Beitza. With Hashem's help, we finished Masechta Beitza, and you should be proud.
Shkach.
Baruch, why is it easy to shecht an animal after you fed it and gave it to drink?
What?
Why is it easier to shecht an animal, you said, after you fed it and gave it to drink?
So, because Rashi says, "Shetehei," you see on my screen, "Shircha de mashkan shetehei," should be noiche, easier lahafshita, to skin the animal, because shehu nidbak yoiser midai babasa, because it heeds more very much to the meat, to the flesh. So if you want to be able to skin the animal easier after you slaughter it, you give it to drink.
I see.
I think they do that. They still do that. I mean, if you ever visited a schlachthaus, you can see them doing that.
They give the drink and to feed the animal.
Yeah, and then they slaughter it. They shachten Mashana. Okay.
All right.
Shkach. Thank
Thank
you.
everybody. Tomorrow Rosh Hashanah. Mazel tov.
Mazel tov. Mazel tov.